Hello all. I think in the past I have talked about deaf interpreters here, and the very first time a deaf interpreter has been documented working in court seems to have been in Ireland. I think I've said this before. I'll have a look and look through the old posts I've done in this page, and I'll put a link below this video. But just to talk about that for a second, the first recorded instance of a deaf interpreter being used in court. It seems to have been 1888, no, sorry, it's 1884. And the deaf interpreter in question came about when a deaf woman was called as a witness. There was an attempted rape, and luckily it didn't actually happen. But after the incident, she was injured and she was very upset. And she testified in court, and a solicitor at the time was able to use sign language and was called in as an interpreter. Now it seems that that didn't work, and so the solicitor brought in his deaf brother to assist. So you had a deaf hearing interpreting team working together, talking to the deaf witness. Their name was Hewson. They were very well known at the time in the Irish deaf Protestant community, and the deaf brother was named Maurice Hewson. So Maurice Hewson was a missioner within the Church of Ireland deaf community in Dublin. So I'd found this case previously and was interested because even though the UK and the US have documented evidence of deaf interpreters in court in the 19th century, it seems that the first recorded instance we have of this was in Ireland. It was in this particular case, bringing the Hewsons in as a deaf hearing interpreter team in Drogheda in that particular case. So today anyway, I'm carrying on my research and looking for more instances of deaf people in court, deaf people who had interpreters. And then I saw this reference to a case that I thought I'd seen before, but this is slightly different, and I'll explain why. So obviously at the time there were various newspapers being published, and if you have a look at the information in two newspapers published the same day, you'll see slight differences. Maybe one account of the incident in one paper might be far more detailed than the other. And so for this particular situation, which happened in Cork, I had already found one newspaper article about it, and I thought, well, I know enough about that situation already. There was an interpreter for that deaf person in court. But I've just come across another article about the same situation that has additional information, which I wasn't aware of before. I'll explain what happened in this situation. There was a deaf guy called Timothy Donovan. And Donovan had a long life of coming into conflict with the law. He was in prison several times, in court several times, and so on. But fairly early in his life, when he was still a young man, this was in 1863, he was arrested and brought into court in Cork. And so when he was being questioned, now this is according to the first newspaper article I found about him, it said that there was an interpreter present, and that interpreter's name was John Good. And he lived in Cork, and he communicated with Timothy. That was what the first article said. But I still have no idea who John Good is and how he knew sign language. I'm assuming he used the two-handed manual alphabet, probably spelling out every single word for Timothy. And then Timothy would respond in kind, or at least that's what I assumed. I wasn't quite sure. It looked like Timothy perhaps went to Cabra as a private pupil. It's not entirely clear. But nonetheless, that was the first article I've seen until tonight. And tonight, the article I found mentions that John Good was brought in as an interpreter, but it mentions that he interpreted through another mute. So when I saw this choice of wording, I thought to myself, aha, that means John Good himself, when he was brought in to communicate with Timothy, that wasn't working. There was miscommunication of some kind. Timothy possibly didn't understand John Good, and so they brought in another deaf person to assist with the interpretation. So this phrase, through another mute, would indicate that. that John Good and this deaf person were working together. Now that's all it says in this new article. I don't know who this deaf person was, what their name was. Maybe they were an ex-pupil of Claremont, that particular school. Maybe they used fingerspelling with sign language. I don't know. But that's what drew my attention. So this first newspaper article didn't have this information. It just mentioned there was one hearing interpreter, John Good. This second newspaper article talks about two people being brought in, a deaf and a hearing interpreter team. So that's really interesting. That was from 1863, which means you're talking 21 years prior to the Drogheda case. You have a deaf interpreter team in 1863. So perhaps that is the first deaf interpreter in court example that we have in Cork, rather than the Drogheda case in 1884. So of course, we obviously have to see if other deaf history researchers in other countries come across instances of deaf interpreters, and maybe in the future we'll find there was an 1850s or an 1830s example of a deaf interpreter in the courtroom. But for now, it would appear that in Ireland we have what could be the earliest, the very, very first example in 1863, this evidence of a deaf interpreter in a courtroom. Wow. So I'll continue doing this really interesting research and I'll keep on with it. All right, bye. Hi, just to add there, I can't exactly claim credit that I'm the first person to discover this John Good guy. I'm certainly not the one who first found out about him. Graham O'Shea actually found out about John Good quite a while ago and mentioned John Good as an interpreter in a different situation in his thesis. The 1847 was the date of that other case, which is, a good few years before 1863. So it looks like John Good was actually interpreting from time to time for quite a long time. So he's been discussed already by Graham O'Shea in his thesis, which is here. So Graham's thesis is a master's thesis. It's very interesting. It's about the history of the Cork deaf community. So I don't want to lay claim to being the first person to find out about John Good. It was actually Graham. So I hope that's clear. Thanks.